Before we begin, a word. This is a story to listen to. This is not a video to watch. There are no clips, no graphics, no fast cuts, designed to keep your thumb from scrolling. Find somewhere comfortable. Put your phone down or plug in your headphones. Let your mind do what it does best. Build the pictures for itself. Because the story you are about to hear is worth seeing in your imagination. And your imagination will do it more justice than any screen ever could. All right, picture a room, not a soundstage, not a backlot, not the kind of room they dress up for the cameras with fake wood and rented paintings. A real room, dark paneling, the color of old bourbon. A table that had seen 1,000 deals made and broken. The kind of room where the air itself felt heavy, like it knew what happened inside these walls and had decided to stay quiet about it. Warner Brothers Studios, Burbank, California. 1970, three men sit down. One of them is Frank Sinatra. Just let that name sit for a moment. Frank Sinatra. There has never been, and there will never again be, a man quite like him in American life. Not just in entertainment. In American life, the son of immigrants who clawed his way up from the streets of New Jersey to become the most recognized voice on the planet, a man who sang for presidents and dined with kings and moved through the world as if gravity itself had agreed to treat him differently than everyone else. By 1970, Frank Sinatra had been the most powerful man in Hollywood for the better part of 2 decades. When he walked into a room, any room, the temperature changed. People stood a little straighter. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even men who had nothing to fear from him felt something shift in their chest. Across the table sits a young screenwriter named John Milius, intense, hungry, the kind of young man who had grown up loving the mythology of American toughness and channeled every ounce of that love into the script sitting between them. The script is called Dead Right. It is the story of a San Francisco police inspector named Harry Callahan, a man so committed to justice, so absolutely certain of right and wrong, that the legal system itself can barely contain him. A man who doesn't wait for the law to catch up with what he already knows is true. Frank Sinatra had read every page. He loved it. He had already told the press he was making this film. He had already chosen the city, San Francisco, because he believed it had never been filmed the way it deserved. He had been carrying this role around in his imagination for months, turning it over, feeling the shape of it. Frank Sinatra wasn't just saying yes to a movie, he was building a legacy. And then John Milius reached under the table and placed a gun on the wood between them. A Smith & Wesson Model 29, chambered in .44 Magnum, 8 3/4 inches of blued steel barrel, the most powerful production handgun in the world at that time, the weapon that Harry Callahan would carry through every frame of this film, the gun that would become as famous as the man holding it. The room went quiet. Frank Sinatra, the man who had dined with Sam Giancana and sat beside Lucky Luciano and moved through the most dangerous rooms in America without ever flinching, looked at that gun. He picked it up. He felt the weight of it. And he said 5 words. 5 words that would echo through Hollywood for the next 50 years. It's a little too big. He set it back down, pushed back from the table, and walked out of the room. What happened next is a story about 3 men, 3 giants, and the moment their worlds collided around a single role that none of them would hold for long. A story about power and pride and the codes men live by. A story about what happens when one era of Hollywood looks the next one dead in the eye and blinks. Stay with me, because we are just getting started. To understand what happened in that room and everything that came after, you have to understand who Frank Sinatra really was. Not the image, not the album covers with the fedora tilted just so, not the television specials where he smiled that particular smile and the audience melted like snow in July. The real man, because Frank Sinatra was genuinely, completely, without argument, one of the most gifted human beings who ever drew breath. That voice. If you have never truly listened to Frank Sinatra sing, not as background music, not as something playing in another room, but listened with your full attention in a quiet place, you owe it to yourself. There was a quality in that voice that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Other singers had more range, others had more technical precision. But Sinatra had something that lived somewhere between the notes, a kind of ache, a kind of knowing, as if the man had personally lived every word of every song he ever sang and was telling you about it from the other side of the experience. He could make a room of 5,000 people feel like he was singing to one person, and every single person in that room believed they were the one. That was the gift. And it was real. He was born Francis Albert Sinatra on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, a blue-collar city across the river from Manhattan that smelled of the river and the refineries and the ambitions of people who could see the skyline of the greatest city in the world from their kitchen windows, but had never quite been able to get there. His father, Anthony, was a boxer and a fireman, a quiet man, a man who worked with his hands. His mother, Dolly, was something else entirely. Dolly Sinatra was the kind of woman that entire neighborhoods are built around, sharp as a straight razor, politically connected in the way that immigrant communities in the early 20th century understood politics, not through elections and speeches, but through relationships and favors and the careful cultivation of people who could make things happen. She was a midwife who held the fabric of that community together, and she knew which doctor to call and which official to visit when something needed to be taken care of quietly. Dolly taught her son something no music school could have given him. She taught him that the world runs on relationships, that talent gets you in the door. But it's who you know and what they owe you that keeps you in the room. Frank Sinatra never forgot that lesson, not for a single day of his life. By the time his voice had turned him into a phenomenon, when the Bobby Soxers were fainting in the aisles of the Paramount Theater and his face was on the cover of every magazine in America, Sinatra already understood that fame was a form of currency, and currency needed to be managed. He needed people around him who could handle the parts of the world that talent couldn't reach. And in the world Frank Sinatra moved through, the nightclubs and casinos, the hotel showrooms, the supper clubs that stayed open until 4 in the morning. Those people had names that most people only whispered. The FBI understood this. They opened a file on Frank Sinatra and kept it open for 40 consecutive years. By the time they stopped adding pages, that file was over 2,400 pages long. 2,400 pages on one singer. They documented everything. His movements, his phone calls, his dinner companions, the men who met him at airports and spent weekends at his side. When police searched the home of Lucky Luciano in Naples, Italy, years after Luciano had been deported from America, they found a gold cigarette case in his belongings. The inscription read, "To my dear pal Lucky," from his friend Frank Sinatra. Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, a man so feared that even other mob bosses chose their words carefully around him, wore a star sapphire pinky ring on his right hand every day of his adult life. A gift from Frank. Sinatra always denied the depth of it. His standard line was, If you sing in joints, you're going to know the guys that run them. And there's truth in that. The venues where entertainers worked in the 40s and 50s, the supper clubs, the casino showrooms, the ballrooms of Las Vegas, they were not run by church deacons. You could not be a working entertainer of Sinatra's stature without knowing those men. But his relationship with them went beyond necessity. A retired FBI agent described it plainly. A few times a year, he said, we would follow certain men to the airport, and they would be there to pick up Sinatra. They would spend the weekend together. He never made a single apology for it. He never tried to create distance. Those were his friends. And the fact that some of them were connected to murders and crimes that would make your blood run cold, that didn't matter to him. Loyalty, that was Frank Sinatra's code, above everything else, above reputation, above the advice of lawyers and managers who tried to tell him who he should and shouldn't be seen with. If you were truly inside his circle, there was nothing he wouldn't do for you. He paid medical bills for people he barely knew. He showed up at funerals when other celebrities sent flowers. He remembered birthdays. He made calls. He opened doors. By every account of the people who knew him personally, Frank Sinatra was one of the most generous human beings in private life that Hollywood ever produced. But that same ferocious loyalty, the code that made him beloved inside his circle, extended equally to men whose business was violence and corruption, because Frank Sinatra didn't make moral distinctions inside his loyalty. Either you were in or you were out. Here is what makes him a genuinely tragic figure rather than simply a cautionary tale. He needed them. In the early 1950s, his career had collapsed. The voice was giving out. The records weren't selling. His marriage to Ava Gardner, the great love of his life, the woman who understood him better than anyone and could hurt him more than anyone, was ending. He was, by any measure, finished. And then a film came along, From Here to Eternity. A role that could save everything, a scrappy, doomed soldier named Maggio. Sinatra lobbied for it personally, begged for it, offered to work for almost nothing. The studio wasn't convinced, and then, according to accounts that have circulated for 7 decades, 2 gentlemen paid a visit to Harry Callahan, the head of Columbia Pictures. They did not ask Harry Callahan to cast Frank Sinatra. They told him Sinatra got the role. He gave the performance of his life. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. His career was reborn. Whether those 2 gentlemen were real or legend, and the people who know are not the kind of people who talk, what matters is this. Frank Sinatra lived in a world where that kind of arrangement was possible, and he had built his life in such a way that those men would make them on his behalf. That is the full picture of Frank Sinatra. A man of breathtaking, God-given talent, a loyal friend, a generous human being, a genuine artist who left behind a body of work that will outlast every person alive today, and a man whose code, loyalty above all, relationships above everything, led him into rooms and friendships that left shadows across his legacy that no amount of great music could entirely erase. By 1970, Frank Sinatra was the chairman of the board. He had earned that title in every sense of the word. And then, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, a cowboy walked into his town. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California. Let that geography sit for a moment. San Francisco. The same city Frank Sinatra would later choose for the film that was supposed to define the next chapter of his career. There is something almost biblical about that detail when you know how this story ends. Clint Eastwood came into this world with none of the things that Frank Sinatra had. No neighborhood network, no mother who knew which official to call, no web of relationships that could open doors when talent wasn't enough. What he had was the depression. His family moved constantly, 6, 7, 8 times through his childhood, following his father across California as the man searched for whatever work he could find. Oakland, Piedmont, Sacramento, Redding, back down to the Bay Area. They were not poor in the way that breaks people, but they were working class in the way that teaches you, quietly, without anyone ever saying it directly, that nothing is given, everything is earned. And the moment you start expecting the world to hand you something is the moment you begin to lose. Clint Eastwood absorbed that lesson so completely it became invisible to him. He didn't think of himself as disciplined or stoic or self-reliant. He just thought of himself as someone who did what needed to be done. By his mid-20s, he had found his way into acting, a contract at Universal Pictures, small parts, forgettable films. And then Universal dropped him. The studio gave him their reasons. He had a chipped tooth that photographed oddly. His Adam's apple was too prominent. And, the reason that echoes down through history, with a particular irony, he talked too slow. Too slow. The man who would go on to deliver some of the most perfectly timed silences in the history of American cinema was told he talked too slow. He took it. He didn't argue. He didn't rage or write angry letters or tell anyone what he really thought. He went and found other work. That was the code already forming. You don't waste energy on things you cannot change. You don't beg for rooms that don't want you. You find the next door and you walk through it. Television gave him 7 seasons of rawhide, good solid work, the kind that builds an actor from the inside out, week after week, scene after scene, learning how to hold a frame and command a camera without ever raising your voice. But Hollywood still didn't know what to do with him. And then the phone rang. An Italian director named Sergio Leone was making a Western. Low budget. Filmed in Spain. In Italian. He wanted an American face. Someone who looked like the frontier, who carried the landscape in his features, who could stand in the desert sun and make you believe he had always been there. He wanted Clint Eastwood. Hollywood was not impressed. A spaghetti western, that's what they called Leone's films, with a dismissiveness that said everything about how the establishment viewed foreign productions. Shot in Spain with an Italian crew and an American actor who couldn't get real work. Clint Eastwood said yes, packed his bags, flew to Europe. And A Fistful of Dollars changed the world, and not because of its plot, not because of its dialogue, half of which Clint barely had. The character he played said almost nothing across the entire film. 3 words where another actor would have used 30. A look where another actor would have used a speech. But that look, that absolute, unshakable stillness. Audiences sat up in their seats because they had never seen anything quite like it. There was no performance happening. There was no sense of an actor working, of a man trying to convince you of something. There was simply a presence. Something that existed in the frame the way a mountain exists in a landscape. You didn't wonder if the mountain was real. It simply was. Eastwood understood something profound about the camera that Frank Sinatra's Hollywood had never needed to learn, because in Sinatra's world, the whole point was the performance, the charm, the wit, the magnetism. Eastwood understood that the camera doesn't lie, that it sees through performance the way sunlight sees through curtains, that the only way to truly hold a frame is to stop acting and simply be. And what Clint Eastwood simply was a man with a code. It wasn't written down. It wasn't something he ever put into a speech. It lived in his choices, in the way he treated the grip who had been up since 4 a.m, the same way he treated his producers. No hierarchy. No star behavior. You showed up. You were prepared. You did the work. You didn't waste anyone's time. Directors who worked with him said the same thing almost universally. He knew his lines before anyone else arrived. He rarely needed more than 2 or 3 takes, not because he was rushing, but because he had done the internal work before he ever walked onto the set. And when the day was done, he went home. No entourage, no scene. No table at the best restaurant where everyone could watch him being famous. He went home, or he went fishing, or he sat in a quiet room and listened to jazz, a love he shared with Sinatra as it happened, and he let the work speak for itself. His code was simple enough to say in a sentence and hard enough to live every single day. Do the work, earn your place, stand for something. Don't explain yourself to people who have already made up their minds. And when a room doesn't want you, find a better room. By 1970, Clint Eastwood didn't need to find better rooms anymore. The rooms were finding him. But what made him genuinely dangerous to the old Hollywood order, to the world Frank Sinatra had spent his life mastering, was that he still didn't care about the rooms, he cared about the work. And that is the most threatening thing a person can be in any industry built on access and relationships and the careful management of who sits at which table, someone who genuinely doesn't need the table. Which brings us back to Warner Brothers and the script and the gun. After Frank Sinatra walked out, the studio had a problem. They had a great script, a greenlit film, and no leading man. What followed was one of the most extraordinary casting sagas in Hollywood history, and every name on the list tells you something true about the era and the men who defined it. They went to Paul Newman first. He read it, recognized its quality, and said no, too right-wing for his taste. He passed, but as he handed the script back, he mentioned a name quietly, almost as an afterthought, a name that would matter later. Then they went to John Wayne. And this is where the story opens into something larger. Because to understand why John Wayne turned down Dirty Harry, you have to understand who John Wayne actually was, not the myth, the man. Marion Robert Morrison was born in Winterset, Iowa in 1907. He built the character of John Wayne, that rolling walk, that particular cadence of speech, that absolute physical certainty, out of pure observation. He watched real cowboys. He studied how men who worked with their bodies and lived outdoors actually moved through space. He built a persona so authentic that generations of Americans forgot it was a persona at all. On screen, John Wayne was the embodiment of a particular American idea. That there is a right and a wrong, that a man knows which is which. That when the time comes to act on that knowledge, you act. Regardless of the cost, regardless of who is watching, regardless of whether it is convenient or safe. He was a man with convictions, strong ones. He made no secret of his politics, his beliefs, his view of America. He said things publicly that made people deeply uncomfortable. He stood behind every word. He did not walk things back or soften his positions to stay popular with the right rooms in Hollywood. You may not have agreed with John Wayne, many people didn't, but you always knew exactly where he stood. And here is the side of John Wayne that history sometimes forgets, because it doesn't fit the tough guy image quite as neatly. John Wayne was, by every account from people who crossed his path, one of the most patient and genuinely kind public figures Hollywood ever produced. He signed autographs until his hand cramped and then kept going. He stopped on sidewalks and in hotel lobbies and talked to fans. Not for cameras, not for publicists, because those people mattered to him. He understood that the people who bought tickets to his films had given him something real, their time, their money, their imagination, and they deserved to be treated like it. Children especially. There are dozens of accounts of John Wayne stopping whatever he was doing to spend time with a child who recognized him, getting down on their level, answering their questions, making them feel like the most important person on that street. That was who John Wayne was when no one was looking. Which is exactly why what happened with Dirty Harry cuts so deep. Wayne read the script. He understood immediately what Harry Callahan was. A law dispenser, a moral force, a man who believed in something so completely he would sacrifice everything to stand behind it. He recognized the character's DNA. His whole career was built on exactly that foundation. He wanted it. And then someone told him the role had already been turned down by Frank Sinatra. John Wayne set the script on the table and said flatly, "I don't like being offered Sinatra's rejections." And he walked out. Pride. That single intractable force that had served John Wayne so well his entire life, the pride that kept him standing when lesser men bent, the pride that let him say unpopular things and sleep soundly afterward. That same pride walked him away from the role of a lifetime. He could not be second. Not to Frank Sinatra, not to anyone. And the cruelest part is what came later, when Dirty Harry was released, when audiences lined up around the block, when it became clear that Harry Callahan was not just a movie character, but a cultural touchstone. John Wayne watched all of it and said quietly to people close to him that he had made a mistake. He saw what the character was. He saw the same moral architecture, the same frontier justice, the same code. You know what is right, you do what is right, you accept what comes from it. He had let his pride speak before his mind could catch up. And it had cost him. The role continued down the list. Robert Mitchum called it a piece of junk. Burt Lancaster and George C. Scott found it too violent. Steve McQueen didn't want another cop role. And then Paul Newman, the man who had said no first, picked up the phone and said 3 words that mattered more than anything else in this story. Try Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood was in the editing room when the call came. He had just directed his first feature, a psychological thriller called Play Misty for Me, set on the fog-draped California coast. He had written it, produced it, and performed in it himself. He was learning in real time what it meant to make a film rather than simply appear in one. Were you still interested in Dirty Harry? His first question was not about money, not about billing. He asked about Sinatra. What happened to Frank? They told him. The hand, the gun, the 5 words. Eastwood listened, let a beat of silence pass, and then said, and these are his actual recorded words, that sounded like a pretty lame excuse. He wasn't being cruel, he wasn't gloating, he was being Clint Eastwood, direct, unvarnished, no performance attached. But it didn't matter to me, he said. I'll do it. 2 words. The exact opposite of Sinatra's 5. But Eastwood wasn't finished. The script had changed since Sinatra's involvement. Rewrites had accumulated. Someone had added Marine snipers to the final sequence, turning what had been a taut, intimate story of one man chasing one killer into something sprawling and expensive and, in Eastwood's view, wrong. He told the studio he was only interested in the original script. The rewrites, he said, were losing the entire point. The moment you make it bigger than one man and one killer, the moment it becomes an extravaganza, you lose the character. And without the character, you have nothing. The studio, which had now been turned down by practically every major actor in Hollywood, said the 4 words Clint Eastwood had been quietly waiting his whole career to hear. Do what you want. He did. He walked those San Francisco streets, the streets Frank Sinatra had chosen in the city Frank Sinatra had loved, and he found Harry Callahan. Not by performing him, by being him, by understanding in the marrow of his bones what it felt like to be a man who believes in something so completely that the world's inability to live up to that belief becomes a daily act of grief. Eastwood understood that man because in many ways Eastwood was that man. The film was released in December of 1971. Lines outside theaters stretched around the block in cities across America. Critics argued about its politics with the kind of heat that only rises when a piece of art touches something genuinely raw in the culture. And ordinary people, who had bought a ticket and sat down in a dark room and given over their full attention, watched a lean, quiet man stand on a San Francisco street and deliver 8 words that somehow managed to be simultaneously a threat, a philosophy, and a question about the nature of luck and fate.
Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
It ran for 17 years, 5 films, 1 constant. Frank Sinatra, that same year, announced his retirement. He told the world, nobody's writing songs for me anymore. And he stepped back. I want to be careful here, because this story deserves that care. It would be easy and dishonest to frame this as winning and losing, one man's rise built on another man's fall.
That is not what happened. Frank Sinatra was 55 years old when he walked away from Dirty Harry. His hand genuinely hurt. The injury was real. The weight of that gun was a genuine obstacle, not an excuse dressed up as one. And beyond the physical, something deeper was true.
Sinatra was a man of extraordinary self-awareness beneath all the bravado. He understood the tides of culture better than almost anyone in the business. He had ridden those tides expertly for 30 years. And in 1970, standing in that room, with his damaged hand and the world shifting beneath his feet, he knew. He knew that the audiences who had made him a god were growing older, and the young people coming up behind them wanted something rawer, something that didn't ask you to admire it, something that simply confronted you. Walking away from that gun may have been the single most self-aware thing Frank Sinatra ever did. He didn't lose that room. He left it, on his terms, without explaining himself, the way he had always done everything. He recorded music until he could no longer hold the notes. He performed around the world until his memory began to fail him. He filled arenas with people who had loved him for 50 years and came one more time to hear the voice. He died in May of 1998. He was 82 years old. Clint Eastwood never talked about Sinatra the way a conqueror talks about a conquered king. When journalists brought it up, he was measured. He acknowledged the lame excuse comment, and then he moved on, because Eastwood didn't see himself as someone who had won something, and he had simply done the work in front of him. And John Wayne? He went on making films. His final picture, The Shootist, released in 1976, showed an aging gunfighter dying of cancer. It was a performance of extraordinary grace and quiet dignity from a man who was himself dying of the same disease. He died in June of 1979. People lined the streets at his funeral the way they lined them for presidents. Because whatever you thought of John Wayne, his politics, his pride, the things he said and stood behind, the people who had grown up watching him understood that he had given them something real.
A man on screen who stood for something, who knew right from wrong and didn't need a committee to tell him which was which.
You can argue about the pride that cost him Dirty Harry. You can say he should have swallowed it, but then he wouldn't have been John Wayne. And John Wayne, for all his flaws, his stubbornness, the enormous pride that was both his greatest strength and his most expensive weakness, was exactly who he said he was. Every single day of his life. 3 men, 3 codes, Frank Sinatra, loyalty above everything. The world runs on relationships, and you protect the ones you have, no matter the cost, no matter what they look like from the outside. John Wayne. Conviction above comfort. You know what you believe, you stand behind it. You do not accept what feels like charity, even when the charity would make you rich. Clint Eastwood. Work above noise. You don't need the room to validate you. You show up, you do the work, you let it speak, and you go home. 3 codes, 3 men who lived them completely, 3 different answers to the same question that every person who has ever tried to build something real has had to answer for themselves. What are you willing to give up to be exactly who you are? Sinatra gave up his reputation, in some circles, for his loyalties. Wayne gave up Harry Callahan for his pride. Eastwood gave up nothing because his code cost him nothing he valued. Which may be the deepest truth this story has to offer.
The man who needs the least holds the most. The gun is still out there somewhere. The actual Smith & Wesson Model 29 from the production of Dirty Harry, blued steel, 8 3/4 inches, the most powerful handgun in the world in its time.
I think about Frank Sinatra picking it up, feeling the weight of it. That hand, the hand that had shaped thousands of notes across 30 years of American music, telling him no. I think he set it down gently.
I don't think he regretted it.
I think he understood exactly what the moment was. He was a man who had spent his entire life reading rooms, and in that room, at that table, he read it one final time and understood that some things were finished and some things were beginning. And he was wise enough to know which was which. He handed the gun back across the table, and he walked out into the California sun. The chairman of the board, right until the end.
That's the rugged truth.
If this story stayed with you, if you sat back and let it wash over you the way a good story should, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Leave a comment with a name you'd like to hear on this channel. Subscribe, because episode 3 is already taking shape. And I'll see you down the road.